Today we will have the first session of our multi-webinar. I would like to introduce you to Ulises Navarro, who is working as the Regional Public Transport Director for Latin America at the Institute of Transportation and Development Policy, also known as ITDP. His presentation is called Experience During the First Year of BRT Implementation, Mexico Cases.
And just give some of the experiences that we had here in Mexico in the implementation of only 3 BRTs. I mean, we have implemented many other, well, 3 BRT systems actually. We have implemented others, but because of time, actually we can't talk about all of them. We're going to be talking several about these 3 BRTs. Several issues which were the most common problems that we had during implementation. They come in several aspects. For example, the buses operation, and that is everything that comes from drivers' experience to regularity of services that serve the trunk routes, frequency of feeders, and other things. Also, we talk about technology, but mostly the technology that have an influence on the user, which is the fare payment and the fare collection system, and how it functioned, and several other issues. Also about negotiations here in Mexico City, and also around the country, in the whole country. Most of BRTs are operated by the former operators. There was the old system, and they made negotiations with the system, so they will go and become part of the BRT system. It's not by tender. It's usually using the same people that was there before. Also, in some cases, there's been some opposition by surrounding business. We'll talk a little about that. Also about neighborhoods that they didn't want to have the BRT around. Also, some planning and design errors that come from inexperience, and also because of some political issues that we'll discuss later. And also the part of the right-of-way enforcement, that usually at the beginning of a BRT systems, drivers are not used to this new system. There are several violations. Okay, let me see how, okay, there you go. We'll start with Metrobus. Metrobus is carrying actually currently about 1.2 million people a day. Boardings actually, there are several transfers, so it might be a little less than that, but actually it's 1.2 million boardings in all the stations, which is quite a huge number, and it's the second after Metro. It's the busiest system, trunk system in the city. It's experiencing saturation during peak hours, so pretty much all lines, and line 1 particularly is experiencing congestion and saturation pretty much for a great part of the day, actually. It doesn't have a feeder system integrated to it, and that comes because originally the first line, Insurgentes, didn't really need one actually, because most of the routes and the services will go from beginning to end along this huge avenue for about 25 to 28 kilometers. But eventually other corridors did need to have a feeder system. However, Metrobus didn't have the policy to implement this feeder system integrated to the system. And one of the things that if you do that in some other cities, like we'll see later, probably the system will fail. No, that's not the case in Mexico City, and that is because Mexico City is so congested that even if you increase transfers, people see benefits in having a dedicated lane and having better speeds in the trunk routes. So Metrobus 1 is the one that goes north-south. It was the first one. Was also the one that had most problems. Actually, it was the first one. And one of the reasons they had that many problems is just because it seems that people learn from their own experience. And there were other systems at the time. There was the León system in Guanajuato here in Mexico. And they didn't pretty much look at the former experience. They preferred to have their own experience. Probably some of the problems that they had was the lack of experience of the operators. They were the original operators now driving these new buses, and there were things that make people even laugh. For example, that they were used to some other type of operation where if you were thirsty, for example, you could go out and grab a Coca-Cola or a Coke and then make people wait, and that made that many of these drivers had to leave the system until they were fired because they have this type of the way they like to operate. Also, they weren't too good at driving the buses. At the time they will approach the station, they will leave gaps, and these gaps were so big sometimes that they caused some accidents at the beginning. Also, there was no frequent invasion. Invasion of the bus lane was not frequent. However, the non-permitted left turns that were forbidden along pretty much the whole corridor, there was no signing for it. So at the beginning, also there were a lot of violations of these left turns, and that made the operation quite slow. Also, there weren't traffic signals for pedestrians, so pedestrians will cross the street and to get into the stations, and that will also slow down quite a bit the operation. Due to this slowdown frequencies, the fleet did not kept up with the frequencies, and additionally, since they have it was for free for the first 2 weeks, there was much more demand that was expected, and we experienced some saturation, a lot of saturation at the stations, as a matter of fact. Now, drivers were really careful, so no accidents were caused during those 2 or 3 weeks of the few months of operation. That was really good. And eventually, to speed up this, the system and reduce conflicts, the traffic police acted in almost every intersection. Now, we're experiencing some other type of invasion. We didn't have much of private cars invasions of the bus lane. However, we have frequent invasion of bus lane by cyclists, and we had some fatalities, as a matter of fact, in the system. When it comes to technology, the problem was the deployment of the first system. The installation did not start until the stations were completed. So during the first 2 weeks, they had it for free actually because it wasn't completed, the installation. Now it has become in the whole country that they usually have the system for free for a few weeks before they started charging for the fare. But originally it was free just because they were not ready with the system. After 2 weeks, the system was not ready yet, so they started charging using a manual fare system that was implemented until completion of the first system. Actually, they will charge people and they give them a ticket to get into the system. Now, design problems and planning problems. Well, not too many actually. When it comes to geometrics and so on. Actually, only one station that had a problem because it was located in a roundabout. And at the time buses tried to approach the station, they will leave a major gap, sometimes about 40 to 50 centimeters. and that was quite dangerous. Now, there's another one, and this was a major problem. It was the pavement. The pavement in the avenue was in good conditions. It was a flexible pavement. However, it was an announced problem because it was pinpointed by several consultants before the implementation of the system, but they weren't heard by the authorities. And actually, after a few months of operation, the pavement was in very lousy conditions. And that comes also because, as we all know, we have a 32 tons vehicle that goes all the time in the same path, and that creates a destruction of pavements as is not usual when you have a mixed traffic. It's happening in other places in the world, and it's always one of the things that we as consultants, when we were consultants, not anymore, talk to the agencies that they need to have a rigid pavement in this, at least at the stations. And negotiations. Here in Mexico, as I said before, most of the systems are operated by the former operators. We see here in the picture how was Insurgentes before Metrobus was implemented. Now, the negotiations started before having a complete knowledge of the current business. Since it was the first one, there was a lot of, the government was really worried about being able to succeed in the implementation of this BRT. So they started conversations during pretty much at the same time where engineering started. And actually they had negotiations when engineering demand wasn't even, the demand studies were not completed yet. There had no financial analysis of the system yet, and this worked in certain ways in favor of current operators that demanded a minimum monthly income because they knew how much money they were making, and they forced the government to agree with a minimum monthly income per each concession that they had. The original concessions were like one bus. If you had one bus operating in the corridor, that meant there was one concession. Well, financial modeling started after government had reached an agreement with the operators. And they also, during that time, the people that was doing the business plan were recommending not to have contracts per each corridor, just to have contracts for the operation of the buses. However, there was also a lot of pressure from operators, and the government agreed to have contracts per corridor. That meant that, for example, the people that operates Insurgentes is Insurgentes fleet. Not you couldn't, in theory, use Insurgentes fleet to operate in other corridors and so on. And that's something that went against the recommendation of the consultants, but that's the way it is here in Mexico City. It had created some problems later on. It's important to mention also that Insurgentes was a very financially good corridor with very high renovation factors, and usually before the implementation of Metrobus, in the black market, concessions were sold for hundreds of thousands of dollars. So it was pretty much the best corridor when it comes to finances in the city. When a couple of years later, they implemented Metrobus 2, Line 2. It's currently carrying more than 200,000 passengers per day, and it's a very directional corridor. What I meant by that is that they connect low-income residential areas at the east with major employment centers at the west. So during peak hours, there were very long trips, a very low renovation. It's not as good as financial as Insurgentes, because of the lower renovation factor and longest trip distances. However, there were no negotiation problems because the operators saw the success of the first line, so they didn't have much of position to get into it. And they thought they were going to make as much money as the one, as the corridor one. And there was some really good negotiations eventually when it came to, because of financially was not as good as the first one, Metrobus convinced the operators of the first one to also help in the operation of the second one. So some kind of subsidy between line 1 and line 2. There were no major invasions and pedestrian issues. And also have to give that Metrobus really learned from past experiences, so they didn't have the same problems that they had in line 1. And currently they are having some problems with cyclists. They don't have a bikeway along this corridor, and cyclists like to use the lane for buses as a bikeway, and that's quite dangerous. Excuse me. Well, when it comes to planning, there are some problems with transfers where the two corridors intersected, and we can see here in the picture. A lot of transfers were happening there, of course, and that created saturation of these two stations in Nuevo León, actually. The way it was sold and was recommended was to have services that would come from Metrobus 2 to get into Insurgentes and operate for a certain length of Insurgentes. This had a lot of opposition from Insurgentes operators. However, eventually, Metrobus has become quite good at negotiations, and they were able to have at least one service that comes from Tepalcates and goes south into Insurgentes. It doesn't get all the way through, it gets only about a couple of kilometers into Insurgentes, but in certain ways has solved the problem of transfers. There was some neighbors' opposition also at the implementation of the system. And also a little design problem, which is the direction of private vehicles for about 5 kilometers of the corridor that they go in counterflow. The oppositions happened only in middle-class neighborhoods, where you have a lower-class income neighborhoods. That there was no opposition whatsoever. But the Metrobus was able to get through this system, and the design in counterflow hasn't produced many accidents yet, and I hope it continues that way. It's been operating now for almost 7 years or 8 years, and I assume that is because people was already used to a counterflow that was there for a trolleybus, electrical trolley that used to operate in the corridor. Well, we get to Metrobus 4, which is in the city center. According to the BRT standard, it's hardly a BRT. However, it's been quite successful. It's carrying about 80,000 people. There were no major operational technology problems at the time of implementation, and there was surrounding business opposition. You can see here a picture how it looked, the area, before the Metrobus was implemented. It was originally thought as a streetcar, but because of financing problems and lack of money, it was decided to go with the Metrobus, which is working quite well at a much lower price. The street here, in this case, is slow, actually, a slow system because the street is shared by buses and bicycles. There was a major urban renovation of the area, and as we can see in the following two pictures, it was before, and this is after. Major reconstruction of pedestrian infrastructure happened in this corridor. Then came Metrobus 5, which was built only half of what it was planned to build, and actually in the following 2 years they will continue this corridor to the south of the city. It is parallel to Insurgentes. I'm seeing some picture really, yeah, the Metrobus replaced the tram, yes, and a much lower price. Okay, it's parallel to Insurgentes, was a very few miles to the east, and it's carrying right now about 90,000 passengers per day, but once it's completed to the south, it's probably go about 3 times that. It didn't have no major operation or technology problems, but was the first design under a concept that is being called here in Mexico City the complete street, where you have bikeways, all the sidewalks were fixed to be able to have universal access, and and you have the bus system right in the middle, and it's working quite well. Now, there was some surrounding business opposition, but the opposition was not because of the BRT system, but because of the bikeway. The business around this corridor were usually are car repair shops and tire shops and things like that. And they used to have their business done right in the middle of the street. And even now, 2 years later of the implementation of this system, there are some invasions of the cycle path and of the sidewalk by parked vehicles. So that's an enforcement problem that we're having here. Well, now recently, a few months ago, was implemented the Metrobus 6. It's like they're implementing lines every 2 years. It's far to the north. It's an east-west corridor that also is carrying, the demand is quite high. It's over 100,000 people in this corridor. And started operation just a few months ago, and starting some transfer problems with Metrobus 5 at the San Juan de Aragon station. I was there couple of weeks ago, and I saw how busy it was even at 3 in the afternoon. So eventually, I think Metrobus might be thinking of doing something similar of what it was done for Line 1 and Line 2 in order to decrease the amount of transfers. Well, one of the things that we can tell about Metrobus in general is that they have learned of past experiences. They have a very good methodology to do negotiations, and they are now very good at operating the system. So many of the problems that they had in Line 1, they didn't have them eventually in the following systems. Now we get into Puebla. Puebla is only a couple of hours away from Mexico City, but it doesn't seem that they took advantage of making a trip to Metrobus and probably asking for the right advice. So they had many problems, particularly during the implementation of Line 1. Line 1 was pretty much a complete disaster. During Line 1, many problems actually. It's a 32 kilometers long corridor. It's very long. It's extremely long actually. At the extremes, actually, the terminals are in areas that are not highly populated or not dense enough. Even the location, I mean, we could probably start with the planning. Problem was that the location of the corridor was already a problem. It was along several avenues that go east-west, where no route made the trip from beginning to end. Most routes, as a matter of fact, were on the corridor only for a couple of kilometers, and some even a few meters. They would just get into the corridor and get out of the corridor. Only about 1 kilometer of the route of the whole corridor suffered congestion during peak hours. So congestion was not. It was a pretty much uncongested corridor for the 32 kilometers long trip. So this excessive truncalization, I call it, increased travel time by increasing transfers. Even though if the speeds along the corridor might be higher, actually there were so many transfers and no congestion to overcome that problem, that actually travel time for many users is being higher. It seems that here they decided to have all the problems. Even in design, the time where construction was going on, we were not involved in this corridor, at least I wasn't. So I didn't notice, for example, but when I went there to see the construction, I noticed that they built the stations to have a 0% slope longitudinally, even when the roadway had major slopes. So that meant that you have one extreme of the station probably 1 meter high, and on the other extreme, the station could have been 1.5 meters. So they had to make repairs after the whole system was built, so they could level off the approach of the vehicle. So there was no agency really, no experience whatsoever in the implementation of these systems. They seemed that they didn't want help, outside help, to tell them at least what to do. Some problems with the technology, of course. The selection of the provider was a little fussy, to say at the least. So it had many problems with the implementation. And actually, it lasted for many months before they have a usable system. With the operation of, well, let's not talk about much about this. They have, of course, problems with the trunk at the beginning that then eventually started working somehow better. But the major problems were the feeder system. The feeder system, they have negotiation problems. They were really well planned at the beginning. So they have problem with frequencies, high waiting times because of that. So because of all these problems, they are having financial problems, and the government had to take over the whole system and is operating it now. When it comes to Ruta 2, actually the second corridor, it worked much better. First, it's much shorter, but that was actually at the beginning in the plan, was about twice this length. However, at this time they asked for consultants that they know a little bit more about implementation of these systems, and they shortened it down a little. So it was in a good location, was a good choice of corridor. So as we can see, even though it's almost 3 times smaller than the other one, a little less long, is carrying 170,000 passengers per day, which means that the location was much better chosen or selected. But there's no fair integration with Line 1. I mean, they have 2 different type of cards. I mean, it's something that they added that way, and they haven't heard much of the advice that they have from different consultants that have been advising them. They had some transfer problems at the north because the corridor was shorter, was cut short from the Central de Abastos. However, they have a good feeder system that at the beginning had some problems, but eventually they were solved when it came to frequencies. Actually, they needed more fleet. And since of the experience of the first corridor, actually, so the operators were a little reluctant to buy buses and so on. But this time, it seems that they're working all right so far. Now, negotiations. Also, because of the experience of the first corridor, more than half of the regional operators were against the system. And well, the governor did something not too democratic at the time. And so he stopped negotiations and gave the concession to ADO, which is a major transportation company here in Mexico for suburban buses. And well, ADO has a lot of experience operating this type of system and it's working quite well. However, most operators, or all the operators, were out of this system. And probably is one of the first experiences of that type here in Mexico. From here, we move back to Mexico City. This is Mexibus, which is the BRT system in the Estado de Mexico. There's a Mexico state, it's called, is the metropolitan area of Mexico City. Has only 3 lines, about 57 kilometers, all of the 3 of them, and it's carrying 310,000 passengers per day. Problems with negotiations, particularly for lines 2 and 3. In line 1, they didn't have that many problems with negotiations, but in line 2 and 3, they're still having some problems. There's no fair integration, so you need 3 different cards to get into the system. However, only 2 lines, line 1 and 2, intersect. The other line is far away, and it connects to the metro system in Mexico City, it connects to the BRT system in Mexico City, but it doesn't connect with the system in Mexico. And we're having problems also in talking about the metropolitan transport. So this is pretty much like a metropolitan transport that do not have integration. Okay, I'm seeing a question here from Jose Lazaro. How much passengers our peak direction BRT transport in its most charged line? Okay. Oh, we can talk about that later, but for example, Insurgentes is carrying 12,000 passengers per hour per direction. All the others are carrying something between 6,000 and 8,000 passengers per direction. Mexibus 1 has passing lanes at the stations, and we'll talk about that in the following. So, as you can see, here's the station of Mexibus 1. It has passing lanes, so you can have express services. It's carrying 170,000 passengers per day. It is in a very suburban area, suburban from Mexico, that brings people from poor areas into the metro station. So it's very directional. So it has a very high demand during peak hours and is carrying up to 15,000 passengers per direction in the direction to the south during the day. Well, there's no fair integration, and that's something really bad. There are no feeders, even though they were planned, originally planned. It was supposed to have a lot of feeders, but it didn't. They didn't implement it, and however, even without the feeders, people having to pay twice, the demand was as expected. So that makes us think that if feeders were implemented, probably the demand would be much higher than was expected during the operational design and the functional design. And finances. There are problems with finances in all BRTs in the Estado de Mexico. And that comes also probably because of the business plan that they have implemented, which is very different from the one in Metrobus. The typical business plan is that the operation of buses is concession to one company, okay? Just like in Metrobus and in any other. So one or two companies do the operation of buses. But also the first system and the infrastructure and the control is concession to another company. And actually, the government just built the lanes. the problem here is that not all the operators were included in the operation, so they keep operating up until now in competition with the system. This fair integration, we already mentioned that. They have the same typical business plan of the ones before, where the private sector is supposed to pay up to 30% of the infrastructure investment, and actually they're already having problems, even though they were implemented just a few months ago, actually a year ago. When it comes to Mexibus 3, it's pretty much 17 kilometers, have passing lanes, so it's a high capacity system. They have the same problems of negotiations, where not all the operators were included in the system. So they are operating in competition with the BRT system. There's no fair integration, no feeders, even though they were planned. There are frequent invasions of the lanes, especially during peak hours where there is congestion. And the same problems with the finances, with the business plan. We had the opportunity to do some auditing to this system particularly, so we looked in detail business plans and demand analysis. There were 3 different studies, demand studies done. And it seems that they picked the one that made numbers worked, and well, with some demands that were not real in these corridors. Because as a matter of fact, what we're having here in this figure that I'm showing here is that probably almost 50% of the demand is carried by the remnants of the system in the basin, the whole basin. As you can see, the red are the boardings, and in blue are the aligning of the buses. So as you can see, people gets into the east extreme of the corridor, and they all the way into Pantitlan. Pantitlan is a metro station here. So trips are very long, not much renovation, and usually high demands during the peak hour, but then eventually during the day, in the off-peak, the demand really goes down. Goes down. Now, what's the problem? Since demand goes down, frequencies are lowered, of course, as less buses come for each during the hour. But since we are in competition with the remnants, and the remnants are smaller vehicles, vans in some cases, they can have more frequencies. So what you can see is that the people prefer the BRT system during the peak hour, but then during the off-peak hour, they're better off using the remnants because they have much more frequencies, less waiting times, and there's no congestion during off-peak. So that has created several financial problems to the system. We went on and we recommended some new type of operations. Actually, the current operation of the system is having 2 express services that go from the most eastern part terminal into Pantitlan, and then one local service. But you don't have many alighting along the corridor during peak hour because pretty much everybody wants to go to Pantitlan. So we recommended them a new type of service where you have a local, of course, the one that stops everywhere, but then you have another type of local limited, which stops in probably about half of the corridor and then goes all the way into Pantitlan, and another one that do the same for about half of the corridors and all the way into Pantitlan. And then you have several express services that stops major demand stations. They are implementing this system. They were able to save some fleet Actually, they're competing in better terms during the peak hour, but not so during the off-peak, because they don't implement this during the off-peak because, of course, there's no demand for it during the off-peak. So that's a problem going on right now for Mexico Stress. Also, we recommended, but this hasn't been implemented, some direct services that could compete with the other services. That requires, however, buying new fleet, and they're unwilling to do that, mainly because they're having financial problems and they don't have enough money to operate right now the system, let alone buy new buses. Well, in a nutshell, and then very fast, we went through experiences of these three systems in Mexico. And we have a few conclusions. When it comes to right-of-way invasions, the only real solution will be enforcement. However, in some places in Mexico, it's very weak, the enforcement in many places. And there are some cases that we haven't talked about, for example, in León, Guanajuato, where there is some kind of opposition between the traffic engineering department and the public transport department. And the traffic engineering department sometimes allows the private car users to invade the lane, which is awful. So it's something that we have to really convince and talk about, even among agencies in the government, that priority has to be given to the public transport. When it comes to technology for the first system, it's never ready when the BRT is first deployed. However, for example, in the case of Metrobus, they have solved this problem, but actually what they're doing is something called timing. Usually, the first system specifications come right after the business plan. I mean, during the project of the business plan, they start designing the specification of the systems. And usually it starts at the end of the engineering project and lasts until construction is almost completed. So usually agencies wait until construction is completed to start the first system deployment. So once you have the stations and the terminals, then you have the deployment of the first system, not before. One of the recommendations is to to have the deployment of the system at the same time of the construction is going on, just like you were implementing, I don't know, the sewage system or the electrical system of the station. So to come in earlier, so you can you can install the system and start operation as soon as possible and do the troubleshooting before it's being done in most systems. When it comes to operators, also drivers training. There's been some training, but usually to a very few drivers. What I think is that when you have a new system in the city, you should probably take those drivers, and especially now in Mexico City that we have many systems, and take them to see operation for several weeks in one of the good operating systems. And this is not happening. They usually do some field trips to see other systems where, I don't know, the minister goes, the secretary goes, but the guys that are really going to operate the system, the drivers, don't go and they don't get any training, and they start learning at the same time where they start operating the system. Design. Expert advice might help, and in many cases we had expert advice in all cases, but for some reasons maybe political reasons, maybe because they have a political agenda and they have a program. The elections might come 6 months afterwards, so they accelerate implementation of the systems, and they do not pay attention to what some consultants says, and they just go ahead, go along, start implementation right away in order to gain some votes, and eventually it might be even bad for the politicians actually when they have a system that doesn't work well, and then you have to, for example, rebuild pavement just a few months after implementation. Negotiations. Here, it's good to see Metrobus experience. They really know how to do that now. And what they really do is just to have a complete knowledge of the system, very thorough knowledge of the system before they start implementation. So they know pretty much how much money each bus is making per day. And with that, they start negotiation, and it has worked for them very nicely. However, in other parts of the country, when they start negotiations, they don't look after this experience, and even if they tell them to do it, they start negotiations before that. It's just like, I assume that we all are like that we don't like to learn from other people's experiences. We like to suffer ourselves. And when it comes to planning, and here's for us, well, I say for us because I was a consultant until not too long ago, that we always have to look at something. We always have to look for benefits to user. Just implementing a BRT just because a BRT is a fashionable thing now is not the reason. We don't have to look much at the speeds of the system. Yeah, when you have a BRT, usually the speeds along the corridor for public transport go up, but you also have many, many transfers. So there has to be a trade-off between speeds and what you lose in transfers. You might start looking at using direct services in many cases, especially for smaller cities where you don't have that much congestion like in Mexico City. And finances. Well, there's a lot to talk about finances, and this is personal opinion of myself. That is that public transportation systems are not financially sustainable unless governments do all the investment for infrastructure. Particularly, I agree that the investment in fleet and operation could go to the private, but it's too much asking for the private sector to do the investment in infrastructure unless you have cases like Insurgentes, where you have renovation factors. Actually, the line use around the corridor helps. It's mixed use, it's very dense, and so you have this type of demand profile that makes it really good for finances. Okay, seeing some questions here. How do you avoid bus bunching? Well, that's a major problem, particularly for Metrobus 1. Metrobus 1 is carrying 12,000 passengers and doesn't have a passing lane. That's probably about 2,000 passengers more than what's supposed to carry, because it's carrying them in very saturated ways. The frequency is 70 buses per hour, and we are having bus bunching. And the way we try to avoid it is using control, making them wait a little bit more in the stations, telling them, talking to them through radio so they stop. However, once you have more than 60 buses per hour, the probability of bus bunching is quite high. And and you have to rely on control, especially where you don't have passing lanes. It's still a problem. I'm ready for questions. Okay, here. What's the frequency? Okay, bus frequency. we're having headways of only 1 minute and less than 1 minute in Insurgentes, which is the busiest one. If I talk about, there are different frequencies. So when you go to Mexibus 1, for example, that have express services and the local services, you probably have during the peak hour frequencies that go even half a minute, but just for a few hours in the morning, and then eventually they really go down.